They quietly replaced the world's money. And you weren't told. Right now, something is happening to the money in your pocket. Your savings account, your business revenue, it is losing power. Not because of inflation, not because of bad decisions, but because the world quietly chose a different kind of money, and nobody sent you a letter. Nobody held a press conference. Nobody warned the business owner, the entrepreneur, the person who worked 30 years to build something. They simply replaced it. And the terrifying part, this has happened before. The people who saw it coming survived. The people who trusted the guarantee lost everything. So the question is not whether it is happening. The question is, which one are you going to be? Welcome to Dominance Aura, where serious people come to understand serious things before it is too late. Now, before we go any further, think of this channel like a wise old newspaper your grandfather kept on the kitchen table every morning, the one that told the truth before the truth became uncomfortable. If that sounds like something worth keeping, hit that subscribe button right now. Think of it as saving tomorrow's newspaper. Today. And one more thing, drop a comment right now and tell the channel where you're watching from. Whether it is London, Lahore, Lagos, or Los Angeles, this community wants to know. Every single comment gets read, every single one. There is a moment in every great financial shift when the signal is visible, but almost nobody reads it. It does not arrive as a crash. It does not arrive as a headline. It arrives quietly, inside a policy document that most people never open, inside a trade report that most people never read, and inside a central bank decision that most people never question. The year was 1944. The world had just lived through 2 devastating wars and 1 catastrophic economic depression. The powerful nations gathered in a small town in New Hampshire called Bretton Woods. 44 countries sat in one room and made a decision that would shape every business, every salary, every savings account on Earth for the next 8 decades. They chose the American dollar as the world's reserve currency. This was not a small decision. This was the decision. Because when a single currency becomes the world's reserve currency, every nation on Earth must hold it. Every barrel of oil gets priced in it. Every international trade deal gets settled in it. The country that issues that currency receives what economists call an exorbitant privilege, the ability to print money that the entire world is forced to accept and absorb. For the ordinary business owner, this privilege is invisible during the good years. Imports stay cheap. Interest rates stay manageable. The economy feels stable. But underneath that stability, a structural imbalance is building, slowly, silently, like pressure behind a sealed door. By the early 1960s, that pressure was already visible to those who were paying attention. The United States was spending more than it earned. It was running persistent deficits. More dollars existed in the world than gold existed to back them. Foreign central banks were beginning to feel uneasy. They were holding paper promises. And quietly, they began asking a dangerous question. What if the promise cannot be kept? One man did not wait for the answer. French President Charles de Gaulle had lived through the collapse of sterling in 1931. He had watched what happened to countries that trusted paper guarantees when the music stopped. He was not going to let France be caught holding promises again. In 1965, he stood before the cameras and told the world exactly what he believed, that the dollar had become not an international currency, but an instrument of American privilege. And then he did something that no sitting head of government had done since the war. He acted. And what he did next changed the forensic record of how to survive a reserve currency collapse forever. There's a document sitting inside the French National Archives in Paris. Most people will never read it. It is not dramatic. It does not look like history. It looks like a shipping manifest, a dry, bureaucratic record of weights, destinations, and transfer dates. But what it records is one of the most calculated acts of financial survival in modern history. Between 1965 and 1968, 44 cargo ships and 129 military aircraft made a specific journey. They left New York, they left London, and they arrived in Paris, carrying 3,313 tons of physical gold that France had quietly, systematically, and deliberately removed from institutions it no longer trusted. This was not panic. This was not speculation. This was a forensic decision made by a man who had studied what happens when reserve currencies fail, and who understood that by the time the public receives the announcement, the decision has already been made for them. De Gaulle called it Operation Vider les Poches, empty the pockets. To understand why he moved with such precision, one must go back further, to a Sunday in September 1931. Britain, then the world's dominant reserve currency, had spent years assuring the world that sterling was sound, stable, and guaranteed. Economists trusted it. Central banks held it. Ordinary savers built their lives around it. Then on a single weekend, without warning, Britain abandoned the gold standard. Sterling fell 24% in weeks. The French central bank, which had trusted the British guarantee and held significant sterling reserves, lost 2.35 billion francs, a sum so catastrophic that the French treasury was forced to bail out its own central bank. De Gaulle was a young military officer in 1931. He watched it happen. He filed it. And 30 years later, when he saw the same structural signals reappearing, this time inside the American system, he did not wait for the weekend announcement. He had already read that chapter. The forensic record across every reserve currency transition in the documented 20th century establishes one consistent pattern. Not a theory, a pattern confirmed by primary sources, treasury records, and exchange rate data. First, the issuing nation begins spending beyond its means. The deficits are manageable at the start. Officials describe them as temporary. The language is calm and confident. Second, foreign holders of the currency begin to feel structural unease. They do not announce this publicly. They begin quietly converting paper claims into harder assets. Central bank gold purchases rise. Foreign exchange diversification begins. It happens in policy rooms, not in newspapers. Third, the government of the issuing nation issues its strongest guarantees precisely when those guarantees are the least credible. September 4th, 1949. Britain's Chancellor stood before Parliament and stated with complete confidence that His Majesty's government had not the slightest intention of devaluing the pound. 14 days later, the pound was devalued by 30.5%. Fourth, and this is the forensic principle that every serious observer must understand, the announcement always comes on a weekend, always framed as protection, always described as using the language of stabilization. Nixon's exact words on August 15, 1971, were a near-perfect echo of what British officials had said 22 years earlier. The dollar will be stabilized. This will protect ordinary Americans. From $35 per ounce in 1971, gold reached $850 per ounce by January 1980, a 2,329% move, not driven by speculation, driven by the gap between what was promised and what the structural record already knew was impossible to keep. The people who came through 1931 intact were not geniuses. The people who preserved capital through 1971 were not lucky. They were the people who understood one forensic principle that de Gaulle understood, that when an institution is under structural pressure, it will protect itself first. The guarantee is the last thing to go, but it always goes. And the most dangerous moment for any business owner, any entrepreneur, any serious accumulator of capital is the moment they believe the guarantee. Because it sounds the most convincing. That moment is arriving again. And the signals this time are not hidden. There's a phrase currently circulating in the private meeting rooms of global financial institutions. It is not in the mainstream news. It is not trending on social media. But the people who manage trillions of dollars in sovereign wealth know exactly what it means. The phrase is the Mar-a-Lago Accord. Most people hear that name and think of a resort in Florida. The people who understand monetary history hear something entirely different. They hear 1971. They hear the echo of a Sunday evening announcement that restructured the entire global financial order without a single vote, without a single public debate, and without a single warning to the ordinary saver who woke up Monday morning believing their dollars were still what they had always been. The Mar-a-Lago Accord is not a rumor. It is not a conspiracy theory constructed in dark corners of the internet. It is a published policy document written by Stephen Mirren, the man who became chair of the Council of Economic Advisors under the current United States administration. Its central argument is precise and forensically important. The dollar is overvalued as a direct consequence of its reserve currency status. That overvaluation is damaging American manufacturing and American export competitiveness. Therefore, the dollar must be deliberately depreciated, weakened by design, by policy, by the deliberate architecture of a new global monetary agreement. Read that sentence again. The architects of current American economic policy are not trying to protect the dollar's purchasing power. They are trying to reduce it by design. In 1965, de Gaulle warned that the dollar had become an instrument of American privilege rather than an impartial international medium of exchange. The United States Treasury publicly dismissed that observation as political theater. 50 years later, the United States Treasury is making de Gaulle's argument itself. This is not a small development. This is a structural confession. The issuing nation openly acknowledging that its currency's dominance has come at a cost. It is no longer willing to absorb quietly. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has publicly described what he calls a grand global economic reordering. That language is precise. It is deliberate. And for anyone who has studied the forensic record of how reserve currency transitions communicate themselves before they complete, that language is the signal. Meanwhile, central banks around the world are not listening to what governments are saying. They are watching what governments are doing. And what they are doing is identical to what de Gaulle did between 1965 and 1968. In the last 3 years, central banks have collectively purchased more than 3,000 tons of physical gold, the highest sustained buying rate recorded since the 1950s. Poland, a nation that lived through its own hyperinflationary collapse in 1923 and understands viscerally what reserve currency faith costs when that faith breaks, has set a target of holding 20% of its entire national reserve in physical metal. China has reduced its holdings of United States Treasury bonds from over $1 trillion to approximately $760 billion, a 30% reduction executed quietly, steadily over several years. Russia, Saudi Arabia, Brazil, India, and South Africa, the BRICS bloc, are actively constructing alternative trade settlement mechanisms designed specifically to reduce dependence on the dollar for international transactions. These are not the actions of institutions confident in the permanent stability of the current system. These are the actions of institutions that have read the forensic record and are acting accordingly. The dollar itself fell approximately 9 to 10% on a trade-weighted basis in 2025 alone. Gold broke above $3,000 per ounce for the first time in recorded history, then continued rising, establishing new records that the financial media reported as surprising. They were not surprising. They were the documented, predictable, historically consistent response to a reserve currency under structural pressure from its own issuing government. The British pound gave the same signal across the 1950s and 1960s. The dollar gave the same signal across the 1960s before August 1971. The signal today is not hidden inside obscure policy documents available only to institutional analysts. It is sitting in plain sight, in Treasury speeches, in central bank purchase records, in foreign exchange data, and in the published policy frameworks of the current American administration. De Gaulle did not need a crisis to act. He needed only to read what the structural record was already saying. The structural record today is saying the same thing it said in 1963, in the same language, with the same institutional behavior, and the same gap between what governments are promising and what the math will allow them to keep. The question that remains is not whether the reordering is happening. The question is what it means for the business owner who has spent a lifetime building capital inside a system that is being deliberately restructured. Around them, there is a specific kind of loss that never makes the news. It does not appear in stock market crash reports. It does not trigger emergency press conferences. It does not produce dramatic footage of people standing outside closed bank branches. It happens quietly, inside the balance sheet of a business owner who did everything right, saved consistently, invested carefully, built steadily, trusted the system completely, and then watched, slowly, methodically, and without a single dramatic announcement, as the purchasing power of everything they had built began to dissolve. This is the loss that reserve currency transitions produce, not the spectacular collapse that makes documentaries, the quiet structural erosion that makes retirement plans insufficient, that makes business capital inadequate, that makes 30 years of disciplined accumulation feel smaller than it should. The forensic record of what happened to British business owners across sterling's long decline between 1931 and 1976 is not a story of dramatic failure. It is a story of gradual repricing. A manufacturing business that held its capital in sterling-denominated accounts watched its international purchasing power fall 74% across 4 decades, not in a single event, but in a succession of managed retreats, each one framed as temporary, each one described by officials as a stabilization measure. The business that held land, productive property, and assets outside the sterling system did not experience that erosion at the same rate. The structure of what they owned protected them from the structure of what was happening. Now examine the American case with the same forensic precision. Between 1971 and 1980, the United States Consumer Price Index doubled. A business owner who held $1 million in Treasury bonds in August 1971, considered the safest, most responsible allocation available, held the equivalent of approximately $300,000 in real purchasing power by 1980. No bankruptcy, no fraud, no mismanagement. Simply the consequence of holding a paper claim on an institution that had made a structural decision to depreciate that claim. The business that held physical assets, productive real estate, commodities, businesses with pricing power and physical gold, navigated that decade with its capital base substantially more intact. Not because the owners were exceptional analysts, because they held things that governments cannot reprice with a Sunday evening announcement. Here's the forensic principle that both cases establish for the serious business mind. Capital preservation during a reserve currency transition is not about prediction. It is about structure. The British saver, who tried to time each devaluation event, 1931, 1949, 1967, and move in and out of sterling accordingly, was playing a game with incomplete information against an opponent who controlled the announcement date. The business owner, who had structurally allocated capital outside sterling-denominated instruments before the devaluations, did not need to time anything. The structure did the work. Today, the business owner operating inside a dollar-denominated economy faces a forensically identical structural environment. The issuing government has publicly stated its intention to depreciate the currency. Central banks globally are converting paper claims to physical metal at the highest sustained rate in modern history. The policy language being used by the current American administration, rebalancing, reordering, stabilization, is the same language used in 1949 and 1971. And the gap between what is being promised publicly and what the institutional behavior of sovereign wealth managers privately reveals is the same gap that existed between 1963 and 1971. For the entrepreneur building a business today, this forensic record carries three specific structural implications. Revenue denominated exclusively in a single depreciating currency is a structural vulnerability, not because the business is poorly run, but because the unit of measurement itself is being deliberately reduced. Capital held entirely inside the institutional banking system of the issuing nation is exposed to the same policy decisions that restructured savings in 1971, without warning, without appeal, and without compensation. And growth strategies built on the assumption of dollar stability are being constructed on a foundation that the issuing government itself has publicly described as something it intends to change. The forensic record does not suggest panic. It does not recommend abandoning businesses or liquidating everything overnight. What it establishes, consistently across 1931, 1949, 1967, and 1971, is that the business owners and capital holders who navigated reserve currency transitions successfully were the ones who made structural adjustments. Before the Sunday evening announcement. Not after. Not during. Before. Because after the announcement, the option to act on the signal has already expired, and the people sitting in the rooms where those announcements are written already know that by the time the public hears the words, the decision has already been made.